Great. Well, welcome everybody. Why don't I get us started even as people are filtering in? My name is Gabe Scheinman. I'm the Executive Director of the Alexander Hamilton Society. It's great to have so many students, alumni, faculty, supporters with us here. For those of you who may not be familiar with us, the Alexander Hamilton Society is a nonpartisan, not-for-profit national organization that seeks to identify, educate, and launch young men and women into the foreign policy, national security careers, imbued with a Hamiltonian perspective of strong and principled leadership in global affairs. We operate on college campuses across the country, cities across America, and bring to you a program like this. If you're interested in learning more, please visit us at alexanderhamiltonsociety.org, and we'd love to connect with you. Today, it's a real great pleasure to welcome my friend, longtime AHS speaker, affiliate, former head of our professional chapter, Elbridge Colby. Bridge is the co-founder and principal of the Marathon Initiative, which is a policy initiative focused on developing strategies to prepare the United States for an era of great power competition. Previously, he was the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Strategy at the Pentagon, where in that role he served as one of the lead authors, even if you won't care to admit it, but the lead authors of the National Defense Strategy, and also played an important role in the development of the National Security Strategy as well of the Trump administration. Spoken on many occasions in many campuses and many places for AHS, and it's a real pleasure to welcome him here. And the reason we're actually here today is to celebrate, but also have a conversation about his new book titled The Strategy of Denial, American Defense in the Age of Great Power Conflict. It's clear-eyed, clearly written, forcefully argued, and I think an incredibly important book for all of us to read and consider as we embark what I think we probably feel like we're at the beginning of, although I'm sure Bridge will argue we've actually been in for quite some time, an era of great power competition. So Bridge, thank you for being here. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Gabe, wonderful to be here. Wonderful. Thanks to you individually as an old good friend, and to the Hamilton Society, which is such a really important and a fantastic institution that I've been proud to have been affiliated with in one way or another for many years, and with conversations like these, and look forward to when you say you're going to celebrate the book. I know I'm about to get it about the head and shoulders, so looking forward to this.
Well, celebrate. I do mean it. I was going to say it's usually when you discuss a book, you want to talk about all the great things about it first, and then all the things you want to, maybe push back on second. But we don't have enough time, and so I'm going to skip the great things and just go to the second things. Just kidding. And then one note, just before we dive in, we're going to leave some time at the end for audience members to ask questions. And to do that, you can do it at any time, but please submit your questions through the Q&A function in the dashboard at the bottom of your screen. And when we get to the Q&A function, I will call on you. I will figuratively hand you the microphone, unmute you for you to ask your question, and then give an opportunity for Bridge to answer. So hopefully it'll be a little bit more interactive as well. So Bridge, why don't we dive into what I think is the essence of the book to start. So your, I think I can call it right, your obsession. I think the thing you're focused the most on is what does the rise of China mean for the defense of the United States and other important interests. So let me ask you, for you personally, what was the moment, or was there a moment or an event for you where you kind of came away saying China's rise will not only not be peaceful, but it would pose a threat to American interests? Because obviously a lot of the conversation we have today is, what did we miss, or what did we get wrong somehow over the last generation? So what was it for you? When did you sort of come to this realization that I think in many ways has motivated your career?
Yeah. Well, thank you, Gabe. That's a really, really good question, actually. And it's funny, I was thinking about it a little while ago, and I went back and I looked at some of my earlier writings, and it is clear that my thinking, I've become more worried. I think I was more worried than others at the time, but I've also become more worried myself. And this is, one of the things about deductive theories is you're never really sure they're true, right? I mean, they sound rational, but, especially we live in time and space, and you think history is one thing, but maybe the future will be different. And I mean, I remember being in law school back in the 2000s, and having a more unclear in my head picture on China, even sometimes thinking maybe being drawn to the G2 idea in an inchoate way. I think by the early 2010s, I think I was getting a handle on that there was something that was going to be a problem. And I think, it's interesting. I don't think there is any one specific action. I mean, I went back and I read, the reason I was looking back, I went back and I read this article I wrote on Taiwan in 2013. And I was thinking, actually, I was a lot more sanguine at the time, but actually I felt that it was pretty consistent with where I've ended up. So I don't know. I mean, I think I'll put, there's an edge that I've developed, I think, about the China issue because of what they've done. And I think, like everybody else, that's largely Xi Jinping, probably. I mean, not personal, but like the way China has acted and behaved has just ramified that. And I think before that, it was a problem that we need to deal with and need to prepare for, but it lacked that edge. But I think since 2014 or so, it's become that edge has become sharper.
Okay. So if I understand the book correctly, the purpose of a strategy of denial, title of the book, is actually to prevent war or forestall war, but to do so from a position of strength, i.e., deter via denial Chinese military ambitions. So I want to unpack that a little bit. So how is a strategy of denial different than a strategy of containment? Because for those of us on the outside, I mean, even me as an observer, to me, it seems pretty obvious, even if we don't want to call it that, which is we're trying to contain their ambitions, which is why, and we can get into whether the Cold War analogy is right or wrong, but it's why there are Cold War analogies. And again, when I think about the title of your book, and also Yale University Press and great Yale professor John Lewis Gaddis, I think about strategies of containment, his seminal book in the early 80s about American strategies towards the Soviet Union.
So I think there's a two-level play with the denial thing. Obviously, you put your finger on the sort of the level of military strategy, but the geopolitical strategy is a strategy of denial, denying China hegemony over Asia. That's like, so it's a negative goal. I prefer balancing. Ashley Tellis wrote a fantastic study years ago that had a big impact on my thinking called Balancing Without Containment. Now, some of this candidly is rhetorical in the sense that the Chinese have sort of picked up on the idea of containment as a bad thing. Then anybody who talks about containment is a sort of crazy Cold Warrior, Dr. Strangelove type. But I actually think what I'm talking about is distinct from the strategies of containment. And going back to like Gaddis's critical work, I mean, I think containment, in Kennan's conception as it was broadly understood, involved actually containing the expansion of Soviet power. I think what I'm talking about is balancing, which is more about ensuring that we and those who are affiliated with us are stronger, all told, than China and its coalition. But it doesn't necessarily mean that a greater degree of Chinese influence needs to be checked everywhere. I mean, partially because I don't think that's realistic, but also I don't think that's what we need as long as we're strong enough together. So, I mean, for instance, like if the Chinese were to make more inroads into Central Asia, I don't think that would necessarily be bad from our point of view for a variety of reasons. But that's how I distinguish containment from denial.
I mean, is this, not to belabor the analogy, but is this in your mind the sort of distinction between, let's say, Kennan versus NSC 68, and you fall more on the Kennan side, which is we do have to contain it in certain critical areas that are the most important areas, but this is not the same as a global or extra regional kind of fight to the death where we must block it everywhere.
It's interesting. I've given that a little thought, and actually, Bob Kaplan and I, in our piece that you and I have had debates about ideology, kind of went after NSC 68 as well. But I find myself on both sides of that divide, and also you're never sure how much Nitze in particular was being clearer than truth kind of thing. How much he believed versus what he really. Because actually, for instance. I think the main point is that I am acutely conscious of the need for us to have a limiting factor. So, I mean, I've said this a few times, but I'm always shadowed by the experience of Vietnam. So someone like me who's talking about escalation management and coalition and alliance and limited war, boom, that's very similar to the kind of people who got us into Vietnam. So I'm always checking myself on that front. Nitze was, I think, as I understand it, was not a fan of the effort in Vietnam, basically. I don't know if that's actually true, but that's my impression. Whereas Kennan, for instance, I think wrongly thought that the competition between the Soviet Union and the United States and others was non-military in nature. I mean, I just think that was delusional. So, I mean, what I would say I'm inclined towards, like, I guess Eisenhower would be sort of like the vein that I'm in. And I mean, obviously, historical analogies are never perfect, and who knows what Eisenhower would have decided. But I think that very, very, what's similar in that is like very, very firm and hard line on the core issues, kind of ruthless on pruning at the edge, and then making and getting the allies and partners to step up. Like those are some pretty key, and a consciousness of like the long-term ability and willingness of the American people to support the strategy that I think sort of Eisenhower like.
So why don't we actually, Eisenhower's a great segue to the question I want to ask next, which is, so why must we convince China that we can successfully defend, against the Chinese attack on what you call the defense perimeter in your book? Why must it be deterrence by denial rather than deterrence by punishment? I.e., we don't need to be able to defend Taiwan. We must simply get China to believe an attack on Taiwan would lead to a, significant, action, possibly nuclear against China. And that's where the Eisenhower kind of comes in, right? I mean, Eisenhower in the 1950s, we considered or analyzed the situation that we were outmanned and outgunned in conventional forces. And our best, if not only way to deter Soviet invasion, in particular of West Germany, was by threatening nuclear retaliation. So why are you focused? I mean, this is really the crux of the book, I think, brass tacks, that we actually must be capable of militarily denying, a Chinese takeover of Taiwan, as opposed to simply being able to deter by threats of punishment that might come with it.
Because punishment won't work. I mean, one thing to really remember about Eisenhower's decision, and this is, I think, true for strategies in general, is they're always contextual, depending not on what you're trying to do and so forth, but what the enemy has available to him, what you have available, trend lines, et cetera. So, this is why I don't like to be kind of thought of, or I don't like to think of myself either as a hawk or a dove, because it's dependent on the context. I want to be a hawk now so I could be a dove later, right? But I think with Eisenhower, we had a nuclear near monopoly. I mean, even as late as the Cuban Missile Crisis, the United States could have launched what was effectively a disarming first strike against the Soviet Union, certainly against the American homeland. Maybe a few would have gotten through, but we basically had nuclear dominance. We don't over China. And so, strategies of punishment work, generally speaking, for the side that has more resolve, right? If you kind of even out other things, right? Because basically, if you're using punishment, you're not stopping the other side's ability to hurt you or something you care about. You're basically saying, I'm willing to, punch you, and I'll take whatever punch you have back, and I'll keep going until we stop, but I'm not going to stop, right? So generally, it's like nuclear deterrence is really, really helpful for deterring, an invasion of your core territory and like the massacre of your population. But as the big problem of American strategy since the end of the Second World War has been extended deterrence, because it's like kind of crazy to say we're going to like risk our own necks for Belgium or Estonia, and that's been the riddle that American strategists have had to deal with, and NATO strategists and others. So I think the problem with cost imposition or punishment in the context of China is where our coalition is going to be that's going to be able to stand up to China is going to be in the Western Pacific. So it's like right next to China. And in the case of Taiwan, the Chinese have a claim to own Taiwan, right? Most Americans could care less about Taiwan, and rationally so, because it's very distant and they've never been there, et cetera, et cetera. So if we get in a punishment campaign with the Chinese, first of all, it's not going to work. I don't think the Chinese are going to give it up. We're going to like put sanctions on them. I mean, this is like Tony Blinken saying he's going to sanction the Taliban. It's like borders on the absurd, or actually probably it is absurd. So like the Chinese take over Taiwan and we say, oh, we're going to, sanction some Chinese banks, and they're going to say whatever. Moreover, they've got an enormous ability to hurt us too. So who's going to be at the end of that escalation chain? Who's going to back down? It's probably going to be us. And I also think that, if we spend 3.5% of our income every year, we deserve better than having that choice presented to us by our military establishment. So, and nuclear, same deal. I mean, now it's very clear that the Chinese are building up a large survivable nuclear force. But if we did the Eisenhower strategy, they would just nuke us back. And the fundamental fact is Taiwan is not worth that.
Why would they do that? But we clearly didn't expect the Soviets to, or we expected the Soviets to, but we thought that it was still worth it to us.
So this is really interesting. My theory, I have a little, I don't know if you remember, but I have a little sort of section on the differences, why it's in a sense harder now than it was during the Cold War, even though the military threat is actually less acute. It's kind of paradoxical. One is, I think so the key in extended deterrence situation, the key what I describe in like the binding strategy, is you can't allow the American people and our allies to think the war is just narrowly about Taiwan. The war has to be seen as part of something much bigger that does affect their vital interests, right? and I go into that a lot. I think in the Cold War there were a couple things. One, better dead than red. People were really afraid of communism, and frankly, the Soviets did. There was a plausible story in which they would become global hegemons, and communism would come, all around the world, and that was a nightmare. And people were willing to die to avoid that. I mean, if Europe was supine, Japan was supine, and it was basically the U.S. and the Soviet Union. So the stakes were seen as really, really high and existential in a way that they're not with China today. Secondly, in a sense, and my friend Frank Gavin has made this point very astutely over the years, and creatively, in a sense, our defense strategy in Europe, at least until the very, very end, was always Eisenhower's, which was basically flood the zone with nuclear weapons. I mean, there were 10,000 nuclear weapons in Western Europe, tactical nuclear weapons in or around Western Europe during the Cold War. So if the Soviets had barreled their way into Western Europe, the war almost certainly could not have remained conventional. So this is Schelling's point about tying our hands in advance. So, once we'd after Détente, people got a little more zen about the Soviet Union, but it was sort of like you couldn't go back. And so I think that's why, but today, I think the perception of the stakes is lower, and nuclear weapons are much more recessed. So, I think people could, A, see losing a war to China over, say, Taiwan and life going on, and B, that it could remain conventional without going nuclear.
So let's talk about the stakes. So you said, obviously, in the Cold War, a debate a little bit about, are the stakes about, communism coming to a theater near you, or the stakes about, the Soviet Union, the state, controlling the means of production, let's say, not only in the way it thinks it does, but in Western Europe and elsewhere. So what in your mind is the political purpose of denying Chinese regional hegemony? What is it that we are concerned about? What is the thing that actually bothered us that we are trying to prevent, in your mind?
Exactly. And let me not sort of express myself poorly, in the sense that I do think the stakes are high, but the stakes are not as seen to be as high by, I think, normal Americans as they were, especially in the early part of the Cold War.
I'm glad you're admitting that you're an abnormal American if you see the stakes as higher than everybody else.
I'm very normal. No, but I think basically what the Chinese, I think, are going after is something that is very standard for great powers, which is a hegemonic position over their area. And the thing is that Asia is 50% of global GDP, or going to be pretty soon. So basically, I think that in a very concrete way, the future of Americans is going to be determined by who, if anyone, controls Asia's economic sphere, right? Because we're so accustomed to Wall Street being the dominant financial market, and the SEC and the Fed determining, whatever the financial flows and stuff, and regulations, and the world beating companies being in Silicon Valley or technology or what have you. Rationally, the Chinese want that. It's pretty darn good to have that in your own country. And if you can have the scale that's necessary to do that, then everything's going to revolve around you. It's going to be your rules. It's going to benefit you. Everybody else is going to have to do it by your leave. And I think we can kind of see this with how the Chinese are behaving in their own society, right? Where the government is shutting down certain industries, elevating other ones, punishing certain groups of people, elevating other ones. That's the future, right? And if they have a dominant sphere in Asia, the reality is we're not going to have enough scale for our workers and our companies. We're going to be subsidiaries of Chinese companies in form or in reality. And that's the kind of thing, so an example I think of is this book is written for everybody. The idea of this book is that Americans should be able to work out their problems on our own terms, not be dictated to by others. I have my own strong views on domestic issues, but they actually aren't really relevant here. But what I will say, the analogy that I make is, I worry about the social media companies, and a lot of people are on both sides of the aisle. Right now, we at least have the idea in America that we could vote in a certain constellation of people, and we can change the rules on the social media companies, right? They're going to have to respond to a different set of incentives. Well, what if the social media companies are Chinese and they're accountable to Chinese leadership? That's the future. So it doesn't mean that we need to dominate China, but it does mean that we need to be strong enough in economic terms to be able to check that kind of domination.
So just let me repeat it back to you, okay, so I understand. So the United States should seek to deny China regional hegemony in Asia, not because, as some have argued, that it's a springboard to an invasion of the United States. Right. Maybe it's a remote possibility and we should consider it, but that's not really the principal reason. But because if China were to achieve regional hegemony, then it would create an exclusionary economic bloc that would not only deny American access to the markets of Asia, but your point, given the global economy, in many ways actually create a chokehold on even within our own market, right? And because Asia accounts for such a large proportion of GDP, it's the ball game in some ways. I mean, this is not control of, you know, sub-Saharan Africa or the Northern Arctic or things like that. Okay, so
you said it better than I did. So yeah.
So if that's the case, if that's the ball game, why is it that when in your mind, and you just said it, you said this is sort of a typical, you know, great power goal, let's say, right? Why is it that when the United States dominated these regions or dominates these regions, it didn't seek to do that? I mean, we never sought to exclude the Soviet Union. They rejected it. We offered it. They rejected it. We obviously have tried to bring in and embed China in it. Hasn't worked out. It's worked out mediocre, let's say, if you want to be diplomatic. So I guess a different way of asking my question is, what is different about China that you expect it to use this regional hegemony to coerce other states and impinge on their freedoms and access to prosperity? Now, I don't mean to say this, that I'm a skeptic that they're doing this. They're doing this every day as we get, but what is it about China, the regime, Beijing, whatever you want to call it, that leads you to say this is why they're doing it in ways that we did not, or the British did not, or whatnot?
Well, I disagree with you. I think we did do this, and the British did do this. I mean, the British had an empire, which had, eventually they adopted a free trade system, but for a long time it had, I mean, that's one of the primary reasons for the revolution is discriminatory, you know, commercial practices and so forth. The French did as well. Certainly the Germans, of course. And we have, I mean, I think it was de Gaulle who called the dollar the exorbitant privilege or whatever. Maybe it was Mitterrand or some one of the other ones that's done. But I mean, we have clearly exercised our power to create a certain model. You know, I think our view would be that that's a more open-handed one, and we've pursued it in a certain way. But I think, you know, from a kind of power perspective, we have taken advantage of our power position to install, or I mean, that's, I mean, especially on the economic side, we haven't had the sort of, you know, kind of clear ability to impose things against people's will, but we have, you know, pushed certain things based on our power. I mean, the Washington Consensus of the post-Cold War period is an example.
But I know you're not making the comparison, right?
Yeah.
But we're not coercing in the way the Chinese are. We never did this, right? We didn't sort of say that's a nice little company you got there, you know, or you must have a certain percentage of ownership, or stealing intellectual property, or excluding others from that opportunity. There's certain sets of rules, sure, but you know, they're open, to your point.
Right. I mean, well, a couple things. I mean, I don't think with the exception of after the Cold War, we have not been in a dominant position, like to impose our will on the other industrialized areas of the world, right? So, I mean, in the Cold War, our primary objective was essentially a geopolitical denial objective, right? Where we were not hegemonic over the European continent. We were contesting, along with our allies, Soviet attempt to essentially dominate. So we were projecting power outwards. I mean, the region over which we're hegemonic is essentially North, Central, and kind of Caribbean, North and Central America and the Caribbean. And then we're more of one of the reasons that we're a natural balancing actor is that we are distant. So our power becomes attenuated, you know, say in Asia, where we've always been one player among several, even at the heights of our power in the post-World War II era. But I mean, I guess, I mean, I think your question is like, aren't our rules and norms inherently sort of more open and permissive? I mean, I like, it's not, I mean, I think you and I might have slightly different views on the political economy issue, but like, I think there are plenty of people in the world who would have preferred, including in the countries that we were aligned with, who would have preferred a different sort of system, right? And who didn't like, say, the Washington Consensus or the policies that we pursued in the Cold War, but had to go along with it, and who don't think it's equitable, you know? And then, I mean, also in the Cold War, I think in particular, you know, our desire to impose our particular political model and economic model was always sort of, I mean, first of all, we're working with a grain of countries that were already kind of with us in a lot of ways. But I mean, like, you know, the Europeans set up a different kind of economic model, and we were willing to go along with that because of the greater good, which was deterring the Soviet Union. So, I mean, I'm not morally equating. Like, I think the Chinese Communist regime is condemnable, obviously. Like, I mean, I hate communism, but I'm looking like, I guess to make a point of it, I think even a democratic market China would still have incentives to set up like a discriminatory system in which our fates would be more determined in Beijing in ways that would not be advantageous to us. In the sense, like, one of my points on this is I actually think what I'm saying, it occurred to me, is very fundamentally American, but it's a certain interpretation of American political history. Some people, when American think about what is most American, they think of the Bill of Rights. But Bill Barr said something interesting last year, I think. He's like, the core of the American political system is the division of powers. And I think that's right. It's a similar idea that we don't want any, even a ideologically like-minded country to have so much power. I mean, frankly, this is provocative, obviously, but I think there's truth to it. The Europeans discriminate against us, So, like, we just want to make sure there's recourse and that we're strong enough to push back.
Yeah, I don't think you're saying this, but I'd say if you want to compare the British colonial system to the Imperial Japan Great East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere to whatever word we might have for the Chinese economic bloc, it's not the same as the Washington Consensus or the GATT WTO consensus, in the sense that maybe there are systems that create rules, but one is meant to be exclusionary or one is meant to be mercantilist in many ways. Whereas I don't think that's what you're saying, that's really the purpose of America creating some sort of like economic block or system.
Well, so obviously I'm not comparing like morally the American system and the Chinese Communist Party is responsible for the deaths of tens of millions of people, and it's a totalitarian system. So that's, but to your point, like what we as Americans, where I'm grounding this whole strategy is in what's in the enlightened self-interest of Americans, right? So I'm not worried particularly about the Chinese invading Red Dawn style. What I'm worried about is our prosperity and then our kind of freedoms being abridged. What I would say about that is, I don't think like the British imperial system or the German customs union of 1917 or whatever is the same as GATT and WTO, but GATT and WTO are failing, right? In the sense that these broad rules-based kind of orders don't actually, especially in the kind of normal course of history, fall apart because the things that actually become predominant are more geopolitically grounded orders, and I think that's what we're kind of seeing happen now with things like TPP, and I'm sure eventually there will be like son of TPP or whatever.
Is that something you supported at the time? TPP
I did support at the time. Yeah, my view on trade is like, first of all, I'm not an expert, so don't look to me. I think we clearly need some kind of scale. If scale is so critical, we clearly need scale along with other countries to match what China's going to be. You have 1.4 billion people who are rising in per capita GDP. And we know that like the cutting edge of modern economy, as well as manufacturing, you need scale. So they have 1.4 billion people just in their own market. So but what I've learned, what I've taken from the last 5 or 6 years is like the American elite, in a sense, has lost credibility on the trade front, and it needs to be earned back. And this is where, honestly, there does seem to be a lot of bipartisan consensus. Catherine Tai was confirmed by a voice vote that we need to get there, but we need to like bring the American people along in the sense that they feel like it's in their interest. So it's going to be a different, I don't know what that's going to look like. That's not my contribution to the national conversation such as it is, but I think the reality is we're going to have scale. So I don't know how we got to get there somehow, but it's got to be in that fashion.
So so a couple of times you mentioned, even in conversation here, and it's a theme throughout your book, of also about a limiting principle, let's say, or a ceiling or concern about, the other side of the equation once you maybe even successfully deny what's there, which is a question about goals. So I want to read a passage of yours from the book. So on page 83, so quote, America's survival as a nation would not be at issue in a systemic regional war with China, let alone a smaller war resulting from Beijing's focused and sequential strategy. To make sense, therefore, any war the United States could plausibly contemplate against China would have to be limited. It would be utterly irrational and foolish to adopt an unrestrained approach to fighting China over stakes short of America's national survival, because doing so would invite damage well beyond what the stakes were worth. So my question to you is, why is China, or the threat of China in your mind, different than the threat of Imperial Japan or Nazi Germany. In both cases, expansionist powers that sought regional hegemony and maybe global afterwards, driven by mercantilist economic policies, clearly regimes of coercion. And you're clearly through the book, you're saying, well, this is not World War II, World War III in that vein. So my question for you is, why is China different in your mind? Or maybe your agreement is maybe World War II should have or could have gone differently, right? That might be another way to look at it. It did not need to have these, total unconditional surrender war aims in the same way. I don't know.
Well, I mean, great question. I would say it is like Imperial Japan, probably. I mean, I would say that China probably resembles, and you, as you know, I do analogize quite a bit to Imperial Japan and Imperial Germany in particular. Could be worse. It could become more like Nazi Germany or Soviet Russia or something. But I guess what I would say is that the war that we fought against Imperial Japan would be limited compared to what I'm worried about, which is a war of survivable nuclear forces with a country with roughly the same GDP as we are. I mean, Japan was like 10% of our GDP, so we could just outproduce them. And I think they launched some like balloon attacks against the West Coast. Obviously, they bombed Pearl Harbor and our territories in the Pacific, but like they really couldn't hit the homeland, and that's very, very different with China. So, from our perspective, and this is where I differ from some prominent realists, is like, I think it was a disaster of American statecraft. I have sort of a conventional view of World War II. Like, it would have been better if we could have prevented it by effectively deterring Germany in like 1936, 37. And Hitler was actually pretty clearly responsive to external reactions. That's one of the reasons he became emboldened, is he figured he thought it worked, right? So history might have been very different. Fewer Americans would have died. We could have actually continued to rely on the European powers like France and the United Kingdom to do most of the balancing in Europe. But anyway, that didn't happen. But I think the core point here is, what I'm thinking is possible is like a thermonuclear exchange of Cold War proportions. That's what we have to avoid. Now, a limited war just means it's limited in some fashion. It doesn't mean it's like small. It could be a huge war. In fact, the war that happened was fought between the United States and Japan, possibly with the exception of the campaign against the Japanese homeland. But I mean, that would be a limited war in the context of what could happen between the United States. I mean, I think that's the scale of the kinds of things we're talking about. But what we don't want is a repeat where we have to fight our way across the Pacific again, because we might not succeed. I mean, again, China's an order of magnitude larger relative to us than Japan was. So I think that's why. But the real idea here is like, and I just I'm so frustrated by the lack of attention. There was a lot of attention to this during the Cold War, but we've really gotten out of practice. But we have to think very carefully about how the way we would fight the war relates back to Americans' concrete interests and our willingness. Like, I think, just to be very frank and a bit blunt, yes, we should be able to willing to sacrifice and risk up to a certain point. But there comes a certain point when it's just beyond what we should rationally tolerate. And there's another part in the book where I quote Clausewitz, I think, to the effect that like the noblest ideal is to behave rationally at all times. So we should not be doing things that ask more of the American people than the stakes are worth. And so that's really like the motivating idea behind so much of what I'm arguing for.
So let's dive into some of the positioning questions, let's say, as you kind of put it. And just to remind everyone, if you have questions, we'll go to questions in a few minutes. Just submit them in writing via Q&A, and then I'll call on you. So, on the one hand, your book and a lot of your other writings and public appearances, there's like an alarm bell coming out of it, right? Because you lucidly describe how perilous you think our position actually is. And like I said, this seems to motivate, it's an obsession in many ways, right? To be able to do this. I think it's important.
Yeah.
On the other hand, I read your book, I look at the maps in your book, and I say, our position's quite good. We are allied with every other rich, large, technologically advanced power. Our geopolitical game in raw terms is pretty good, from Japan to Australia to, India to whatever. And none of these are really in danger of falling into the Chinese camp. So how should we look at this? Is it that we're sitting pretty, or we're in mortal danger? Because it's also a very different position, let's say, obviously pre-World War II or World War I, in either theater for that matter, where, as the example you just gave, and it's throughout your book, our position in the Western Pacific or in Asia before World War II was perilous. Everybody knew it. And there's no question about that. Here, it's a little bit different. So I'd love for you to kind of assess that, kind of almost bipolar
it's a great point. In fact, some of the things that are going well are actually making it more dangerous. And the key point here is that the importance of military force and the increasing allure of military force from a kind of rationalistic perspective to Beijing. So, if you look at a map and you kind of look in a sort of gross terms at GDP, for instance, abstracted from issues of resolve and posture and so forth, then we look like we're doing well, right? If you kind of tally up. But the problem, and as I go through in the book, I think in a lot of detail, is that that's not how wars would actually influence international politics. I mean, likewise, if you looked at the map of Europe in 1863, would you envision that over the course of the next 8 years, Prussia would turn into a Germany that could have hegemonic aspirations, right? I mean, if you tallied up the balance, it would seem, oh, that's not going to happen, right? And I think the point here is, like the market, I think international politics in these kind of competitive situations can change very quickly, especially because a lot of it is about perceptions of momentum and credibility and reliability, right? So the key here is that coalition coming together, and will it actually fight, right? Because a coalition that's just there on paper doesn't matter in a war, right? If it's about G7 statements and EU statements, fine. But that stuff doesn't, if somebody's willing to put it to a test of arms, that stuff's not going to matter unless it translates into military capacity, right? I mean, we vastly outweighed North Vietnam, right? But we weren't willing to do what was necessary to actually win that war, right? Because it's a matter of resolve. And that's the issue. And here are a couple of things. I mean, China is a unitary state that has developed a military that is specifically designed to go after neighboring states and beat them into submission, essentially. Taiwan first, but now very clearly others. Meanwhile, our allies, I mean, Japan spends 1% of its GDP on defense. Taiwan is finally moving up. Korea is totally focused on North Korea. Australia is a small country. It can contribute a little bit. India is obsessed with South Asia, right? So these are all, and we don't have like a one for all for one model, which didn't really exist that much in NATO anyway. But like, we don't even have the pretense here. And then the US has been doing stuff in the Middle East, is still doing stuff in Europe, is building things for other reasons. We have as somebody put it, our forward posture in the Pacific has been studied to death over the last decade, and very little has changed. So, think again about Bismarck, where things can change very quickly, or Japan, which was a bit player before 1894, and within 10 years had fundamentally changed. So that's why I'm very worried. And the other thing is, if China goes after Taiwan as part of trying to break apart this anti-hegemonic coalition, I think its incentive is to keep moving before the balancing coalition comes together, right? So actually, if I were advising them in Beijing, I would say, don't stop. Not that you would like go Genghis Khan style, but you might issue like ultimata to like the Manila to suspend EDCA, for instance, is the return of US forces to the Philippines, for instance, which essentially would disable that robust military posture. So we're in very, very dangerous situation.
So you mentioned Bismarck a couple of times, and you actually have a chapter in the book that is about, what is China's best strategy, right? Or try and put yourself in the shoes a little bit and kind of play it out in really interesting terms. So, and you mentioned it again in 1863, let's say in Europe. So in your mind, it seems like you would want them to be Bismarckian, right? That they should seek, not that you actually want them to do these things, but that like if you were advising them, right, you'd want them to be this way. They should try and prevent the congealing of this anti-hegemonic coalition by picking off states one by one, doing just enough to get what it wants, but not enough to trigger the coalition. But that doesn't seem to be what it's doing, right? I mean, it seems to be showing hostility across the board. I mean, threatening South Korea, Australia, obviously the United States, Taiwan, literally, getting into, killing Indian soldiers, right? India. I mean, this is not saying to everybody, don't worry, don't worry, don't worry, and just going after one thing. They seem to, at least in the last, 4 or 5 years, some can argue even before, have just blown up across the board. So is it that they're, being dumb, in your mind, like they're being bad, rising hegemonic ambition people? I mean, what is it that they're doing?
It's a great point. I mean, they haven't precipitated a 360 conflict, So I think you're right, but I wouldn't take it too far. But I think you make a very good point. I mean, look, I think, was it Napoleon or somebody said, never stop your enemy when he's making a mistake. I mean, they are clearly making a mistake. Like what they're doing to Australia right now. They're just showing that they're mean and aggressive and that they are going to abuse their power without achieving their goal. So, we've made our share of mistakes. The Soviets made their share of mistakes. The reason I focus on their best strategy is because they can always adapt to it. And if we're not prepared for that, we'll lose. That's why it's their best strategy.
It's not too late. The mask has not dropped.
The mask has dropped.
To do this.
The mask has dropped, but this is where the insight about bandwagoning is so important. And actually, at another, one of the critiques I've heard from Jenny Lind, who's a very prominent scholar at Dartmouth, she pointed out, a lot of countries in Asia probably would be okay with compromising their autonomy. That I think actually the Chinese who knows? Maybe they're doing it the right way, but I wouldn't underestimate the value of coercion in inducing countries to bandwagon. I mean, Lee Kuan Yew had this very cutting remark about the ties, fairly or not, which he said they always bend before the wind blows, right? So a lot of countries in Asia will probably, in Europe and wherever, but in Asia today will be Duterte talks about this all the time, will consider making a deal. So it's not clear that I don't think they're optimizing at all times, obviously, but I think they are not, they're somewhere in this vicinity. And the thing is, if they really just tick everybody off, the coalition kind of forms by itself as long as we do the bare minimum. But what I would be worried about more is that they would correct. And this is, to some of the points that you've made in our conversations over the years, I think this is an area where we can help them make mistakes, like help them be their, get in touch with their inner sort of coercer or whatever.
Well, so that leads to my next question, which is, what could or should we be doing to occupy real estate in Xi Jinping's head? Like, what can we do to frustrate and bother them, to get them to make mistakes, to undermine them in different ways? I have my own thoughts in the sense that they certainly fear their own people, right? And they spend an inordinate amount of money basically on internal security measures. And a lot of what you see now, in fact, with some of these, Chinese companies, banning of Bitcoin, things of that nature, are very much in this mind of control of their population. So if they think that's their greatest weakness, should we not seek to exploit that to, precisely your point, not get to the point where we're facing a head-to-head conflict? So how do you think about those things?
Yeah, no, I think that's all fair game. I mean, I've talked about this, but one of the critiques I've gotten on some of my other writings is that I don't see, I completely ignore ideology, and that's actually wrong. What I'm saying is that this is, for us as Americans, this is not fundamentally about ideology. It's not about making China into a democracy. It's not about, it's not the priority goal. But ideology is a form of competition, and it's a weapon of the competition. And if there are things that are rationally correlated to our overall goal of achieving a stable balance that's sufficiently in our favor, then we should pursue them, including ideological warfare, including discomfiting the Chinese political system. Now, we have to be conscious of the risk there, of course, but I think, to your point, obviously they're very worried about it. So I think those things are fair game. My goal here, though, is to make sure that we get that military piece right. Because if we do all that, if we get all the G7 statements in the world, if we get the OAS to say something, whatever, and we don't get this military piece right, then it's not going to matter. And because, in this sense, it's sort of maybe a little old-fashioned, but I just think it's true. Mao was right. Power comes out of a barrel of a gun. I saw Fareed Zakaria yesterday saying the power doesn't come out of a barrel of a gun. I think it does. I agree with the Chinese communists on that point. And that's why it's like having cops in a neighborhood. If you don't have law and order, you can't really worry about commercial development. And the same here. What we want to channel the Chinese into a system where they essentially, their best interest is to deal with us on terms of respect.
I guess I'd push a little bit more on that, which is, there's certainly those out there that say actually our goal should be a liberal democratic China. And I guess all of us should want that, right? Whenever, people say, would you like to see a different regime? The answer should, of course, be yes. Of course, I'd like to see a different regime. But in this case,
that's for their benefit. That's not our job,
For their benefit. But my question here is not, should that be the goal? My question more is, given that they themselves fear, their own people in different ways,
right?
Are things that we could do to try and exploit that, undermine that, would force them to spend more to pay more attention to it, and then say, you know, this Taiwan thing, right, or this first island chain thing, you know, maybe we got to, you know, reprioritize, you know, our objectives here, or maybe we can't do this in 3 years, we got to push it back to 7, right? I mean, it is part and parcel of avoiding, you know, or making more costly the thing that you're most concerned about.
Oh yeah, no, I completely agree with you. I mean, I don't want to be boring, but like, yeah, totally. I mean, again, we need to look at it, but I mean, you know, in the way that I guess Brzezinski was all focused on exploiting the ethnic divisions in the USSR. I mean, you know, I do think we have to think about this morally, always, everything we should think about morally, but in a particular sense, which is weighing our responsibilities and what we're trying to achieve. But like, yeah, I mean, they're super worried about that, about the ideological, about freedom, people's freedom to speak, to worship. I don't think it can substitute. I don't think you were suggesting this, but we have to have that stone wall along our defense perimeter. But at the same time, and that gives us leverage, you know. I mean, that we can go back and forth. But no, I completely agree with you that's fair game.
So one last question for me before going to audience questions, because I can't not ask you a question about the Middle East, right? Because you're trying to leave it and it won't leave you. So and I could talk a lot of different questions, but one of the key things I think that where you've stood for a long time, and in many ways separated you from a lot of other conservatives, is about the American war in Afghanistan. I think you supported the 3 administrations in a row theoretically trying to withdraw. You can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think initially you only supported a limited American mission in Afghanistan to sort of go after Al-Qaeda in the early years. And so in many ways, it's not that you supported withdrawal 2 years ago, but even 10 or 15 or, you know, something along those lines, let's call it. I also know that you've been shocked and dismayed and abhorred, obviously, about the way in which we ended up, the Biden administration, getting out. So now that it's happened, and in the way in it's happened, how do you think Beijing sees and processes this, right? Is it, hot damn, the Americans are finally shedding these peripheral, you know, matters and, you know, we're in trouble? Or is it, wow, the Americans are so incompetent, they couldn't even withdraw in an orderly way from a country they dominated for 20 years that they supposedly signed a peace deal with? Right. You know, I'm not asking the point about credibility. Is this a question of credibility of allies and other things, but just almost the competence in American power? Like, how do you think they see this now that it's happened?
Well, I think that's the issue. I mean, and I think you put my position well. I mean, I supported the withdrawal. Just to step back for a second, because I think this can be a kind of a cheap shot. But I mean, I don't think it's cheap to say it was right to withdraw, but we need to do it correctly and well. And I mean, as my good friend and partner Wes Mitchell puts it, so much of this is about the nature of the dismount, you know, from difficult situations. And, you know, back in the old days of the debates about Iraq, one of the arguments that really used to tick me off was people who would say, the Bush administration and its lieutenants in Iraq are so incompetent because they haven't turned Iraq into a flourishing democracy in 2 minutes or whatever, you know. And it was like, often it was a way of separating themselves from their support for the invasion in the first place. And it's like, well, the reasonably anticipatable consequences of the invasion, in my view, I mean, just this is my view, were that it was likely to create a chaotic situation. So it's like the incompetence charge was a cop out. Or some of the stuff, you know, the critiques of something like the intelligence.
That wasn't my question. I mean, that wasn't the way I phrased it, right? I mean, it was more. How does the Chinese see it?
I want to say this because I think there are some critiques of the administration that I think are a little bit unfair. Is not, but a little bit seems a little cheap. So what I'm saying here is that there are charges of incompetence that are fake and lame. A military operation designed to withdraw our citizens and people that we want to take out on a reasonable basis without a chaotic and embarrassing collapse, that is a reasonable request from our national security enterprise. That is something that we should be able to do. Each of us pays almost 3.5% of our income. I mean, 3.5% of our income every year. And we deserve better than that. Like, that, I think, is reasonable. You know, and clearly they completely misassessed the situation. And I'm including not just the senior people in the administration, but senior military, you know, 4-star guys who are wearing 4 stars, who should know better, or who if they were ignored, should have resigned on principle, no question, right? So they apparently were saying, no, we think we're going to hold on for a long time. We're going to go on vacation, right? That's a tell. Okay, so that's my view, is that we should have been able, and if it meant being kind of colder about the situation, then that was what was required. Is it going to affect the Chinese? I think competence is the issue, not so much the credibility of our commitment. As you know from the book, my view is the commitment in Afghanistan are clearly differentiable from those in the Western Pacific. It's kind of a reasonable man standard, like from the law. Like, it depends on the context. People can clearly see if you're living in the Western Pacific facing the Chinese, that's different than like this long, basically, in my view, mistaken nation building enterprise in Afghanistan. But you really start to wonder if the Americans are capable of pulling something like this off and doing it in a way that's consistent with, with good order, basically. So I think, I don't know what they're thinking. My feeling now is that we probably need to project strength to the Chinese and others, because, in the way that I think the last Trump administration, the Soleimani strike was a very important part of an attempt to step down in the Middle East, was to say, this is how we're going to do things. And if we decide to come back in, it's going to get hard, nasty for you. And that's that gets at that dismount point, which is, and I'm not the expert on exactly how to do this, but like in a different way with Europe, it's important, right? Obviously, we're not going to be hitting people in the face in that respect, but, having a smooth transition so the Russians don't see a huge opportunity and create more problems that will make it harder to focus on, that's critical. That's what statecraft has got to be. My book does not have all the answers on how to do that. That's where I'd like the conversation to go, though. That's what I hope is like, all right, got it. We understand we've got a transition. We're going to have a lower presence here. How do we do that? That's where, and I don't think that's where the debate has been. And that's probably one of the reasons why the Afghanistan thing turned into such a debacle, was a lot of these guys were like, it's not going to happen. We're going to stonewall it. We're going to be able to keep doing things the way we want to do it. And we can't have people like that. We need people in leadership who get it, who want to make the transition, and will do so in good faith.
But I was going to put you on the spot to say, so what would a demonstration of power after this incompetent episode look like vis-a-vis China?
I don't know. That's a good question. I'll have to think about that one, because that's delicate. You're going up against the big dragon there, and you want to make sure you're not. It could be something quieter. Frankly, some of what like the Air Force Secretary has been talking about with the B-21 rollout. The fact that I guess we were building more than had been reported. Those kinds of things. That's not enough on its own, but just they've surprised us, at least in public, about the scale of their nuclear buildup. It seems like a good time for some revelations.
Okay. All right. Well, we could go on forever, but I want to go to a bunch of questions. So, Peter Kunze, I'm allowing you to talk, as Zoom says. Go ahead, introduce yourself and ask your question.
Great. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. So, this is Peter Kunze. I'm with the Department of Treasury. My question is focused on operational analysis. So, a lot of the scenarios and analysis around Taiwan focus on how arduous it would be to cross the straits, right? So, people will say, about to be the largest invasion since D-Day. They'll go into all the details of that. I buy that analysis, but I guess I'm curious if there's other operational concepts where the Chinese could surprise the Taiwanese forces and us, because they recognize that as well. And I just wonder if there's sort of an Ardennes-like opportunity where, similar to how the Germans surprised the French in 1940, that the PLA might try something else in order to hold territory and essentially win out in a protracted limited war. Thanks.
Well, thanks. No, good question. I think at the end of the day, they've got to bring over and sustain enough forces to defeat the Taiwanese military and U.S. forces that are involved in defending Taiwan. And I think they need to get over by either air or sea. So, I think the Ardennes example would suggest that there might, for instance, people sometimes say that, some of the beaches are not usable most of the time of the year. Maybe that's not true. The same way that people thought the Ardennes was impassable, effectively. So I think that's a good point. I tend to, at the strategic level, I'm not so worried about surprise. I think we kind of know who the biggest danger is, and we know their potential targets. I'm more worried about surprise at the operational level, because it can have strategic impact if they can, seize and hold that territory very quickly. The only other thing I'd say, by the way, is that it is really hard to get across the strait. That is an advantage for us, but it's not like a given. One thing people kind of tend to forget is like, yes, amphibious invasions were hard, but the United States has been able to do them for 75 years, essentially with impunity. Like, we've had a large amphibious fleet that we could have landed anywhere we wanted in Asia for the last 75 years. If we'd wanted to invade Indonesia or Malaysia or Philippines, we could have totally done it. So if the Chinese can establish sea and air control basically over the strait, they can do it. It's 100-year-old technology, basically. So we shouldn't, I know you weren't, Peter, but I think we shouldn't take too much comfort in that. It's an advantage, but it's not like, it's not something we should rely on too much.
All right, let's go to Josh Chang, who has a question that's, I think, in some ways a sequential or follow-up vein on that. Josh, go ahead.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. Hey, Bridge, this is Josh Chang from CSBA. So one question I had for you, so your strategy of denial sort of focuses on preventing Chinese hegemony within the Indo-Pacific. And obviously the linchpin of that is around Taiwan. But I know the PLA studies community has been sort of looking at the PLA sort of operating as a global military, you know, with their base in Djibouti and all these multiple deployments across the world. While rightfully so that we're focused on, you know, preventing a Chinese fait accompli seizure of Taiwan, how would you sort of tailor your strategy of denial to address, you know, a globally operating PLA? Maybe the case that maybe the CCP under Xi believes that, hey, we can, like, we're still going to focus on Taiwan, but we can also pursue simultaneously global deployments and global operations to challenge the US internationally. So how do you think your strategy could sort of address that sort of possibility in the future?
Well, thanks, Josh. Great question, and very important one for the defense establishment. My view is very straightforward. We have to make sure we win the critical battle. Two Churchill quotes. One is, if you win the decisive theater, you can put everything right again. And the other one is that he compared, I think it was the Graf Spee, which I think was at the beginning of World War I. It was in the harbor of Buenos Aires or whatever. Anyway, it was like a commerce raider for a few months. But he said it was like Churchill said it was like a cut flower, beautiful but fated to die. So you put these two ideas together. If we win in Taiwan, given the nature of the power projection challenge for China, they will be bottled up. So those forces farther out will be cut flowers, fated to die, right? We can get them at our leisure. And frankly, there's not much they can do anyway. I mean, the forces in Djibouti, how much gas do they have? You know, we could ask the French or the British to blockade those bases if we need to. But if we lose in Taiwan, well, then they're going to be able to project power, and they're not going to stop. So it's critical we win in that near fight. So, you know, you may have heard me say this, but you know, there's a strong tendency in the defense establishment for commands, that non-Indo-Pacific commands, to say, hey, we're part of the China fight because the Chinese are globally deploying. And it's like, no. We got to win in the Western Pacific first. And if we can do that, then we'll worry. And we should be offloading those responsibilities as much as possible to allies and partners as necessary. So really, it's critical we win in that. And our planning elements should be always thinking of themselves as economy of force efforts that are going to try to rely on others as much as possible.
Can I just, I guess as a moderator, two finger that if you go a little further, which is, sure, wouldn't a Chinese war on Taiwan, even a successful one, right, or maybe especially successful one, wouldn't it jeopardize even the goal of creating this economic prosperity sphere? I mean, presumably not only the United States, but also our allies would, maybe stop trading, would stop investing, maybe lead to an economic embargo, at least for a certain amount of time. I mean, would that not then change the calculus of what happens the day after?
I don't think that's what would happen at all, honestly. I think a lot of our allies would be likely to go right back to normal because they need the Chinese. And I mean, you see this in Europe. I mean, even without they're sanctioning German politicians, and the Germans are, Merkel's trying to get this trade deal back. I mean, the Chinese are 25% of the global economy, 25% of the global economy, and they're willing to use these carrots and sticks. And most countries are, and I say this in not a moralistic way, they're weak and dependent. So they aren't going to be able to stand up. Only the United States can lead that coalition. And frankly, even there, I wonder. I mean, Kirk Campbell said something in response to a Taiwan question, I think from the FT a few months ago, where he said, well, he's sort of suggesting that there would be this economic blockade. I mean, the largest asset management firm in the United States has just made, as far as I understand, has just made a major decision to increase investment in China. I mean, even our pensions probably need some degree of Chinese investment. So I just think, the economic blockade, economic sanctions thing, I don't think it's going to work. We might even lose in that war because they're probably more resolute than we are. I mean, they have a centrally controlled economy at the end of the day. We don't. We have a decentralized political system. So I just we want to avoid that if at all possible, both because it's not going to work. It's not fair to the American people. Our allies aren't going to, even in Japan, they have a lot of, in Taiwan, there are a lot of people who are sympathetic to going along with the mainland for exactly that reason. So I actually think frankly, I actually think one of the reasons I'm so worried is I think to the contrary of what you're saying, it's possible that would be the outcome. We don't know. But I also think there's a possible story in which the Chinese use of force against Taiwan really helps create that, because people say, okay, like, we're going to get in line, forget it. They're too scary. We're going to cut our deal now. And that could actually snowball.
Okay. All right, great. Let's go to Elliot Seckler. Elliot, the microphone is yours.
Hi there, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Great. So my question is China's military denial strategy capable of thwarting a U.S. strategy of denial that's posed in your book? And what are the current asymmetric strengths of China's military relative to a U.S. strategy of denial?
Well, thanks, Elliot. Great question. I mean, China's strategy is not one of denial. China's strategy is one of subordination. I call it the focused and sequential strategy, but basically to subordinate enough states within the anti-hegemonic coalition to cause it to collapse, and then everybody has to deal with that new reality. China's building a military to do that. They haven't used the terminology that I'm talking about, but it matches the military, because they, in the first couple decades following the Taiwan Straits crisis, they built what's generally called an anti-access area denial military, essentially missiles and basically things to shoot down American aircraft or shoot American ships coming near to China, sort of a denial. But now, over the last few years, they've increasingly been building a power projection military, and Josh was pointing to that. Aircraft carriers, a space architecture, nuclear-powered submarines, a Marine Corps, amphibious forces, these kinds of things. This is a military you build to go out and impose your will on other people. It's the kind of military we have for that reason. So the Chinese are developing, people talk about symmetric and asymmetric. Actually, Gaddis talked a lot about it. I'm not hugely enamored of like the symmetric, asymmetric kind of thing, because the Chinese are building, like, I don't know, both symmetric and asymmetric. I don't even know what that means. And I don't mean to pick on it's more because you hear it in the discourse. I think the Chinese are building a military to achieve a certain thing, and we should be building a military that's designed to deny them that, using means that would be politically palatable. So, they're, in some sense, military force development is one of the most credible signals of political intent, because it's really expensive. It takes a long time. It's very deliberate, and they're building something to go out and impose their will on other countries.
Bridge, I think maybe it could even be helpful. You do it a little bit in the book. Could you like paint a picture for us, illustrate for us, what is the fait accompli campaign, Chinese campaign against Taiwan look like? Is it a matter of days, weeks, months? Is it pre-positioning things that we see that we can't see? I mean,
Sure.
There are people who spend, volumes obviously doing this and doing it over again in 6 months when things change. But how do you describe it the way you see it? And that might be a way to kind of get at some of these issues.
Well, I think with the caveat that Peter raised a good point, which is that we shouldn't have too much of a point solution. I mean, the basic idea is to get and sustain enough military force across the strait to seize and hold Taiwan's key territory, which basically is populated areas, military bases, economic centers, these kinds of things. Taipei, Kaohsiung, these kind of important areas, mostly along the coast in the case of Taiwan. I think that basically involves, air assault and, amphibious forces that are protected by air, sea, and other, land-based forces, reconnaissance and what's called C4SR architecture, as well as probably strikes, again, more distant strikes of some level and severity against U.S. forces to try to degrade the ability of the United States to help Taiwan defend itself. Probably at the same time, there would be a blockade and bombardment, by air and missile forces against the island, against key targets, maybe against population. I don't think that would probably be necessary for China in their best strategy. But enough, and I think what they'd want to do is probably try to lull us into complacency. I'm quite worried about the cry wolf problem. In 1973, the Israelis and the Americans weren't surprised because we didn't know that the Egyptians and the Syrians had a military and were training for war with Israel. We were surprised because we thought that they would just kind of like activate their military and then go down, and it was just this thing that they were doing, and we kind of started to ignore it. And that's actually a really effective way of generating surprise. So what I'm worried about is that that's actually maybe what they're doing with their provocations along the median line in the strait. It's just kind of like dulling our senses and trying to hide the signals in more noise, if you will. So that's what I'm worried about. And then, if they seize Taiwan, people say, oh, well, it's only 100 miles from the Chinese coast. Well, the island of Luzon is like 100 miles from Taiwan. Okinawa is probably, within 200 miles of Taiwan. South Korea, by the way, is 100 miles from the Chinese coast, the Qingdao, basically, roughly. So, I mean, they can kind of rinse and repeat. Sounds like a little mechanical, but I mean, I don't think China would have to do it that many times to basically show that the Americans were hollow. And then everybody would have a strong incentive to cut their deal. So that's like, and then you never have to fight the big war. Just like Bismarck didn't need to fight all of the potential opponents to German reunification or unification. He just did it in sequence, and before anybody knew it, suddenly there was German unification.
Great. Eduardo Castellet, you're on.
Yes. Hello, Mr. Colby. My name is Eduardo. I am a junior at American University, majoring in international affairs. I'm here with AHS, so thank you for organizing this. My question relates to the Sino-Russian intent. To your knowledge, is there any specific area or specific topic where Mr. Putin and Xi Jinping are colliding, an issue where their countries not only don't agree, but where the US could potentially exploit a weakness or a disagreement among them?
Well, thanks, Eduardo. That's a great question, and I think you're looking at it in the right way, because we do want to distance Russia from China. The real question here is how. I mean, I think I keep mentioning my partner, good friend Wes Mitchell, but he points out that attempts to reset the relationship and essentially be nice to the Russians haven't really worked. So, we should learn from the experience. Doesn't mean we take a maximally adversarial position, but I think we have to be realistic. And the Russians are aggrieved, and they're ambitious, and they have a sort of a revanchist attitude. I think the biggest fundamental pain point between Beijing and Moscow is the simple fact that Beijing is becoming incredibly strong, and they're neighbors, and there's a natural sort of impetus for them to clash over those interests that they both want to be dominant over. Central Asia is a great example, right? I mean, that's traditionally was part of the Soviet Union, obviously part of the Russian sphere for many, many centuries. Increasing Chinese influence there is inevitable. It's in Belt and Road and all these things. Not to mention Chinese influence in the Russian Far East and so forth, as well as among Russia's traditional allies in Asia, like Vietnam, India, etc. So I think, in a sense, what America needs to do is sort of not always put itself in the front of the change in Russian orientation. Really, what I think would change Russia's orientation is a much deeper and immediate appreciation of the threat from China. And that's not something that we can convince them of. I mean, we're not, they have a strategic culture of many centuries, et cetera. We're not going to teach them how to do that, but it's a reality, and they have to know it, right? And so the question then is, how do we take advantage of that as that evolves? And again, Wes has a great proposal in the most recent issue of the National Interest, which is to kind of separate our Asia policy towards Russia from our Europe policy towards Russia, which is to say, try to actually encourage Russia to be part of the Asian element of the coalition while holding firm in Europe, which I think is one very promising way of looking at it.
So we're kind of up against the end of time, and I want to end on a question that you sort of deal with towards the end of your book, but I'm sure one that you'll be dealing with a lot over the next 5 or 10 years, which is how do we measure the success of a strategy of denial? I mean, is it simply every day that China doesn't seek to invade Taiwan shows the strategy is working? Or put differently, what maybe it's hard, right? But what metrics would you use, or what milestones that you might leave with all of us, so that when we can kind of look at developments and say, oh, that's an example that it's working, let's say?
Very interesting. So well, there's two parts of that. One is is the strategy being implemented, which it's only imperfectly being implemented at this point, despite the 2018 National Defense Strategy kind of largely moving in that direction. That, I think you can look at our military forces, that of our allies, how we talk to our allies, what we ask them and insist they do, that kind of thing. There, we're getting better, but we have a long way to go and we need to do so much more urgently. Then there's the question of how successful. I guess if we don't do it and there's peace, then I think I probably exaggerated the problem, right? And I was demanding too much from our military. In that case, then what I would say in my defense is, well, then we may have wasted some money, but we covered down on the more extreme risk. If we don't do what I'm saying, and the Chinese are aggressive and take over Taiwan, then I think it suggests that
you'll sell a lot of books.
Yeah, I mean, sadly, that would suck for us, everybody. except Xi Jinping. So then if they implement the strategy and there is peace, then I think, this is the dog that didn't bark, the tree falling in the wilderness. This is the Cold War, and I would be happy to have that problem. To me, that would be success. Would be like, if we could get to happen. People are like, oh, we're not in a Cold War, and I'm thinking to myself, from a military perspective, in Europe, the Cold War was a huge success. We won, and we didn't have to fight a big war. I mean, this like never happened in human history. So that would be success. I mean, if we do what I'm saying, and there's still a war, then you'd have to look more at the decision making. It could be that I was just wrong. It could also be that we didn't do enough and stuff. But I'm just trying to think about like what
like what do you look for? Assuming it gets implemented in the way that you would want to, right? What would you like to see, I guess, functionally on Chinese behavior or potential other, coalition state behaviors?
I would like to see the Chinese start to maybe pull back a little bit in their direct threat across the strait and to countries like the core countries of our coalition and our alliance network, and maybe see them try another tack. Like actually, if we saw them try to go back to hide and bide, I'd actually think that would be an indicator of success, because they would be saying, we're hitting up against a brick wall or stone wall, and now we're going to try something different because that's not going to work, and it's hurting us. So that would actually be in the same way that I think the Soviets basically, particularly after Khrushchev, were like, I mean, Brezhnev, there was a huge buildup and everything, but like basically said, we're going to go to Afghanistan and Angola and Cuba, because Europe, we can't make it work. So that would probably be, because I don't expect them to just like give up. But if we can turn, this is kind of my, maybe I'll, conscious of the clock, like one of the problems I have with the Biden administration approach to this, I think they're right in their focus on China, and I commend them for that. But I think they say this is largely going to be a political, economic, and technological competition, not a military competition. That's actually our goal. That's success. That's not a given. Like, if we take our eye off the ball of the military competition, it will be a military competition because the Chinese will have an incentive to use it. So if we get it to be just a political, economic, and technological competition, that's success. But that's not a given.
Well, on that note, I think that's a great way for us to leave it. And these aren't quite your words, but you kind of said it in different places, which is if the next generation or two generations ends up like the Cold War, that's a success. If it ends up like World War II, that's the failure.
Right.
It would be great to have. This is a large country. It's going to grow. I don't think there's any way around that part, but growing it in ways or managing the competition in a way that it is primarily a political and economic one, not a military one, to your point, shows that we've achieved the first part, which is, kind of put that brick wall in the water, so to say, to get us there. So
yeah, that's exactly it.
Well, Bridge, thank you. Congratulations on a really wonderful book. As I said to you beforehand, and I'll say to all the students here, in my view, this is international relations theory done right. You can read the book for its policy application to Taiwan and the First Island Chain and our Asia strategy writ large. You can also read it as a great way to frame and conceptualize how do great powers plan for great power conflict. How do they work through these difficult concepts of deterrence and denial and credibility and resolve in ways that I think is really, really accessible. So I hope that it's read not only in the Beltway, but beyond the Beltway, especially at universities as a way and gets its way. You'll know you really will have accomplished something in life if you made your way into a intro to IR syllabus on how to do things. So congratulations for that.
Well, thanks, Gabe. It was a pleasure and such a pleasure to be with you and AHS. So thank you very much for the kind words. Really enjoyed it.
Great. Thank you, everybody. See you soon. I think our next book talk was with former colleagues of Bridge in the Trump administration, Dr. Fiona Hill, on her new book in a couple weeks, I think on October 21st. So be on the lookout for emails from that. Until then, thank you, everybody. And thank you, Bridge.
Thanks, Gabe.